Someone carved a hawk into my doorstep the night before the blizzard came, and I knew, without knowing why, that something had found me before I had the courage to go looking for it. Chapter 1. How could I flee what had already learned my name before I knew to call it? Enemy. The wind arrived like a warning, not a whisper, not a breeze, but a wounded cry, raw and relentless, tearing across the valley and latching onto the eaves of my cabin like it meant to drag them loose. It shrieked through the gaps in the logwork, rattling the stovepipe, testing the latch on the door. The sound was so human it made me sit up straighter, as though someone out there was calling my name with a mouthful of snow and sorrow. I didn't answer. I hadn't answered anything in 3 winters. The fire hissed low in the hearth, struggling against the damp pine logs. I cupped a tin of bitterroot brew between my hands, bitter as old pennies, but warm. The real tea had run out years ago. Sugar too, but salt remained. In the cupboard and deeper in my bones. Enough to preserve a heart that had forgotten how to ache. Outside, snow moved sideways. Not down like it used to when I was a girl, and the world still had softness. No, this snow was mean, intentional. The sky hung so low you could mistake it for a ceiling. The horizon vanished after October and hadn't returned. I used to wait for spring. Now I just waited for something to break. The cabin was quiet, but not the peaceful kind. It was a silence that pressed on your ears like a hand you couldn't see. A silence thick enough to breathe in. My only companions were the groan of timber, the crackle of fire, and the memories I hadn't invited but came anyway every night like ghosts that didn't need permission. Isaac used to say storms were God's way of reminding us we were small. We used to race each other to board up the windows, laughing like fools slipping on the porch. We'd hold our daughter between us like she was the center of the world, which in truth she was. Then the fever came. It took Maisie in 3 days. It took Isaac the week after. What it left behind was me and the kind of silence that didn't go away when the storm passed. That winter, the church folk brought bread once, then stopped. I heard the whispers. She buried them herself. Didn't wait for the pastor. Didn't cry right. Must be cursed. I was no longer a woman to them. I was a warning. Still, I stayed. I wore my wedding dress that first Christmas after mostly to spite them. Now it hung limp in the wardrobe lace stained with soot sleeves graying like the sky. These days, I wore Isaac's old work shirts and skirts patched at the knees. My boots had been resoled with rawhide twice. My hair, once pinned with care, was now jagged from the dull knife I'd used the day I swore off mirrors. That night, I moved through the cabin like a revenant, fed the stove, brought in a bucket of frozen water, cracked open kindling with numb fingers. I did everything I was supposed to do, except pray. I hadn't done that in years. God had stopped answering when I stopped asking. Then came the knock. 7 raps. Even. Spaced. Deliberate. Not frantic. Not begging. Not lost. A rhythm that felt like ritual. My hand froze on the flour sack. My ears strained against the quiet. The fire hissed. The wind paused. The silence held its breath. No one knocked here. The last to do so had been a deputy looking for a boy who'd run off with someone else's horse and a bottle of fire whiskey. I'd lied for the boy. Fed him sourdough and let him sleep in the barn. He'd left before dawn, left behind a single feather on the porch. I stood legs stiff, heart ticking like a slow metronome. Ghosts. Drunks, men with worse in mind. The rifle leaned near the door, untouched for years. I didn't reach for it. Not yet. I stepped to the threshold, every footstep louder than it should have been. My hand found the cold iron latch. I breathed once, twice. Then I opened the door. And the world changed. 7 men stood in the snow like they'd been carved there, broad-shouldered, silent, snow clinging to their furs and braids. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The one in front, taller than the rest with a scar across his jaw like it had been earned in silence, lowered his hood, His eyes met mine and didn't flinch. "We seek shelter," he said. The voice didn't match the storm it commanded it. Deep and quiet like river stones worn smooth by time. I didn't answer right away. They weren't armed, not visibly, but their presence shifted something. The air changed. The fire behind me leaned inward. My breath came too fast, but I held still. They waited. Men who did not ask twice. I should have closed the door. I knew what the town would say. I knew what Isaac might have said once upon a time. But the truth is, it'd been dying slowly. And death, once it makes a home of you, is hard to evict. These men with their silence and eyes like history felt less dangerous than the loneliness I'd let rot inside me. So I stepped back, and they entered. Their boots made no sound on the wooden floor. One crouched beside the stove without being told. Another rubbed his hands together. A third unwrapped a bundle of cloth and set it near the hearth like an offering. They didn't speak, but they carried the kind of silence that listens. I ladled the last of my stew into mismatched bowls. The scarred one stepped forward and took his gently. "Thanks," he said. "No more than that." But it was enough. Later, as they unrolled their furs and lay side by side like stones across a riverbed, I watched them from the loft stairs, heart thudding, not from fear, but from the shock of not being alone anymore. The fire crackled. The wind whined outside like it had missed its chance to break me. And just before sleep took me, I thought I heard the snow whisper something that almost sounded like a name. Mine, or his, or maybe both. Because when I rose the next morning and opened the door there on the step, etched into the frozen wood was a hawk. Wings outstretched, looking east, waiting. Chapter 2. How do you name the feeling that comes before the feeling has a name? By morning, the fire had burned low, but the silence inside the cabin had changed its shape. It no longer pressed heavy against the walls like grief with weight. It lingered softer now, like breath after weeping, or the hush that follows a lullaby not yet forgotten. I woke before the men, the warmth from the hearth barely reaching the loft. My legs were stiff, my hands aching from chores I'd done alone for too long, but my mind was clear. Too clear. Something inside me wouldn't settle. It didn't feel like fear. Not quite. It felt like standing on the edge of something with the wind pulling your coat in one direction while your heart whispered another. When I stepped down, they were still asleep. Rolled in furs, curled like animals who trusted the night not to turn on them. Many Feathers lay nearest the door, one hand resting near the hilt of his blade. He didn't stir, though I knew he wasn't fully asleep. Men like him rarely were. I moved quietly as if not to disturb the strange spell we'd conjured just by surviving the night together. I opened the front door and the cold struck me like a slap, but I hardly felt it, because there carved into the wood of the threshold was the hawk. I crouched without thinking. It was no shallow scratch. This had been etched with care. The lines were clean, precise, the wings stretched open, the beak mid-cry, the eyes looking east as if anticipating something I hadn't yet seen. I hadn't heard him do it. Hadn't seen him rise. The wind had howled all night, yet not loud enough to mask the work of a man with purpose. I stared at the hawk too long. Not because it was beautiful, because it was intimate, and because something inside me wanted it to mean something. Back inside, I lit the fire again, trying not to let my fingers shake. The cabin smelled of pine and melting wool, and something else, something warm and human that hadn't lingered here in years. The men began to stir, quietly, without fuss. One stretched near the stove, another pulled his boots close to the embers. No one asked for anything. They moved like people who'd learned long ago not to expect more than they could carry. I offered hot water steeped in dried mint and laid out what little I had left from the root cellar, jerky hard cheese, dried apples. The men accepted the meal without words, heads lowered, hands gentle. They weren't trying to impress me. They were simply present, and somehow that was harder to accept than kindness. After breakfast, they moved outside like a current. One began clearing snow from the barn path. Another checked the chicken coop. Two more hauled firewood with practiced ease. They didn't ask what needed doing. They just did it. I stood at the window with my hand wrapped around my mug, watching Many Feathers as he split logs near the tree line. His movements were deliberate, even elegant. He didn't hurry, didn't waste motion. Each swing landed true, the wood falling open as if it trusted him. I'd seen Isaac chop wood, seen him curse when it splintered wrong, throw the axe when the blade dulled. Many Feathers didn't curse. He just worked, as though the rhythm itself held him together. Later I stepped outside with a piece of bread wrapped in cloth and half an apple I'd saved for no reason other than it reminded me sweetness still existed. He didn't turn when I approached. "You saw it," he said. "The hawk." He nodded, setting the axe down with care. In my dream, it flew east. Said I should leave a sign. Said she'd need to know the wind had changed. I wasn't sure if he meant me or someone else, but I asked anyway. "Do you believe dreams I've learned to? I used to." He looked at me then. His eyes weren't cold, they were quiet, like river stones smoothed by stories too long buried, and they didn't look away when I stepped closer. I want to believe I admit it, though my voice cracked when I said it. "Then do." He didn't smile. He didn't touch me. But something passed between us just the same. I handed him the bread. Our fingers touched and my breath caught, not because it startled me, but because it didn't. I went back inside too quickly. Inside, I busied myself with quilts. I brought down the ones I hadn't touched in years. Isaac's mother's stitching still strong along the seams. I laid one over each man when they rested, careful not to wake them. When I reached him, I hesitated. He didn't move, but his hand reached up slow and steady and closed lightly over mine. He didn't squeeze, didn't pull. He simply held. And I let him. Later, I sat at the hearth with the carved hawk set on the mantel like a totem. The fire snapped and sighed. I sipped hot water with the last mint I'd hidden in the back of the drawer. I stared into the flames and tried to name the feeling blooming inside me. It wasn't comfort. Not yet. It wasn't love. But it was something dangerously close to remembering how to want. And that terrified me. Not because I didn't want it, but because I didn't know if I could survive losing it. The wind picked up again outside. Snow swirled past the windows. Shadows shifted across the walls. But inside, the air was warm. And I was not alone. For the first time in years, I whispered a prayer, not to God exactly, but to whatever force had brought 7 strangers to my door and carved a hawk into my threshold. And the prayer was not for safety. It was for courage. Chapter 3. What if danger comes dressed in what you used to call home? The tracks weren't there yesterday. I saw them just after dawn when the wind was still soft and the snow hadn't yet learned to lie. 3 sets. Boots. Heavy. Sharp-edged. Fresh. They traced a path from the edge of the woods to the barn, circled the logs, then bent toward the chicken coop like curiosity pretending not to be hunger. They stopped by the window, then vanished back into the trees. My breath caught, not from the cold, but from something older. The kind of fear that doesn't shout. It just remembers. I hadn't heard them, not a snap of twig or shift of snow. But I felt them now, in the way the quiet leaned heavier on the roof, in the way the hawk carving on my doorstep seemed to look east with a sharper eye. I stood frozen for longer than I meant to. And then I heard it. The soft hush of footsteps behind me. Many Feathers. He didn't speak at first, just knelt beside the nearest print fingers, brushing the edge like he could read the tread like a page. "Not ours," he said, though he already knew I knew. "They didn't knock," I whispered. "They weren't here too." My hands curled inside my shawl. "Locals?" His jaw tightened. "Just enough. They've been watching." The word slid between us like a knife. Something inside me tightened. Not just fear. Something meaner, familiar. A memory of women who smiled too long. Men who prayed too loud. Townsfolk who never touched grief but acted like they owned the right to bury it. I looked toward the trees. "They think I'm hiding something." "You're not," he said, standing slow. "They think I'm protecting you." He didn't answer. Didn't need to. Because we both knew that's exactly what I was doing. Inside the cabin, the others had begun to stir, but they didn't crowd or question. They moved with the same quiet reverence they had when they arrived. One checked the hinges. Another tied rawhide between the porch and the barn so no one would lose their way in a storm. Two brought in more firewood than it'd seen stacked in years. And two made broth, boiled water with garlic and dried sage, peeled potatoes like they might hold prophecy. My hands shook. I told myself it was the cold, but I knew better. It was the sound of the world leaning. That evening, the sky turned amber at the edges like the horizon had caught fire, and no one had noticed yet. Many Feathers stood by the window, sharpening his blade with slow, even strokes. The sound was rhythmic, like breathing through stone. They circled the barn, he said, eyes fixed on the trees. Didn't come close. But they will. It wasn't a threat. It was certainty. I ladled stew into bowls, my hands steady now. If I focused on the weight of the spoon, the heat in the ceramic, I didn't have to think about how close violence felt. Why, I asked. They want to remind you this land isn't yours. But it is. He met my gaze. That doesn't matter. And it hit me then, truth sharp and bright. This wasn't about me harboring strangers. It was about a woman choosing silence over compliance, care over fear, fire over forgetting. That night, one of the younger men, a boy, really left a carved piece of driftwood on the mantel. A buffalo head, rough and strong. He didn't speak, just nodded once, like he knew something was coming too. I wanted to ask him what it meant. Instead, I stared at it long after the others slept. And then I saw the second hawk. Many Feathers was carving again by firelight. But this hawk wasn't like the first. This one was leaner talons, sharper wings tucked like it had flown through war. You've seen worse, I said, softly. His hand stilled. Yes, but you didn't want to bring it here. No. I moved closer, the heat from the stove warming only half my skin. Do you think it's already here? He looked up at me, and for a heartbeat, I felt stripped bare, not by lust, not by gaze, but by something deeper. Like he saw the war inside me I hadn't dared name. It never really leaves, he said. The next morning, the snow had hardened into crust. I tried to haul water from the creek, but my boot caught an ice-slicked root, and I fell hard. My hip screamed, the bucket rolled, and for a breathless stretch of sky I couldn't move. Then warmth, arms, steady, silent. He lifted me like I weighed less than truth. His cheek brushed mine as he shielded me from the wind, and in that single touch, I felt something crumble inside me that had stayed too solid for too long. He said nothing as he laid me near the hearth, removed my boots, wrapped my legs, then disappeared. When he returned, it was with willow bark and boiled water. He didn't ask permission. He didn't hesitate. He just cared. You should rest, he murmured. I should fight, I said. His eyes flickered. You already are. That night, I didn't sleep. Not really. I lay curled in Isaac's quilt, staring at the rafters, while the wind hummed the tune of something about to break. And in the silence, I said his name. Not Isaac. The other one. Soft. Like maybe if I said it quietly enough, the world wouldn't notice. But I knew better. Because out there in the dark woods past the barn, someone else was already listening. Chapter 4. How do you stand your ground when the world's already decided you don't own it? The sky had turned silver, but the wind still carried the smell of smoke and old iron like. The land itself was bracing for something. I stood at the window mug forgotten in my hand and watched the horizon sharpen. The trees no longer whispered. They waited. Then they came. 3 riders, moving slow but not from caution, from certainty. Curtis Flynn was at the front. I hadn't seen him since the winter Isaac died, but some men wear their arrogance like a second skin it doesn't wrinkle with time. He'd been the kind to shake your hand too hard to offer help you never asked for, to stare too long at widows. To stepped outside before I did. Quiet. Blade still sheathed, but his breath steady. There was something about the way he moved that made the snow seem quieter. I followed with Isaac's rifle in my hands. My fingers barely fit the stock anymore. Too thin, too shaken. But I held it like a memory I wasn't ready to bury. Curtis pulled his horse to a slow stop. Well, now, he said, voice too easy. Ain't this a picture? The mountain woman and her guests. His eyes flicked toward to then back to me. Another man, wiry and sharp like broken glass, let out a crooked laugh. His shotgun hung loose in his arms, more insult than defense. "Heard you were sheltering some trouble," he added. "Thought we'd come see if the stories were true." I didn't answer. Not yet, because I knew what this was. It wasn't a visit. It was a message. T's eyes didn't move. He stood like the wind itself had drawn a line between us and them, and he had no intention of letting it blur. "You need to go," I said, trying to keep my voice from shaking. Curtis laughed low and familiar. "That's not your call, Clara." He dismounted slowly like this was a barn sale, not a warning. "We just want to talk," he said. "No," Tu replied quiet. "Certain. You want control." The third man, barely more than a boy with wide eyes and a twitch in his hands, took a step forward. His grip on the shotgun shifted. Not steady, not sure. Just afraid in the worst direction. Tu's stance shifted. Barely. Curtis held up a hand. Now, he said like he was calming livestock. "No need for fuss." I lifted the rifle. "You came to take?" I said louder than I meant to. "But there's nothing here for you." Ain't that the thing Curtis said? "What's yours to say?" That's when the twitchy one moved, quick unthinking. He raised the shotgun. The world slowed. I barely had time to breathe. But Tu was already moving. Like wind, like instinct. He crossed the space between them in a blink, drove his shoulder into the young man's chest. The shotgun spun into the snow. The boy hit the ground with a groan. Curtis reached for his pistol. I fired. The shot missed, but not by much. It struck the tree beside his head with a crack that split the quiet. He flinched. Thoreau's knife in hand, now blood already starting to bloom on the second man's thigh, a deep clean cut from a second strike I hadn't even seen. The second man dropped. Curtis froze. Tu didn't move. Not forward, not back. He just waited. And it was that stillness that made Curtis back away. He looked at my rifle, still raised breath, still ragged. Then he turned, left his men groaning in the snow. Didn't look back. We tied their wounds, gave them enough strength to sit a saddle, sent them down the trail with their heads low and their pride bleeding through their coats. The forest swallowed them whole. Later, I found Tu by the creek, blade in hand, water darkened with blood that wasn't his. "You didn't have to protect me," I said. He looked up. "I wasn't protecting you." I blinked. "I was protecting this," he said. "Whatever it is." I didn't have an answer, just stood beside him while the cold licked my boots and the trees held their breath. Back at the cabin, I lit the stove again. My hands still trembled, not from fear, but from knowing what could have been. Tu came in slower this time. He looked at the rifle propped by the door. "You fired to miss," he said. "I didn't mean to." I lied. "You did." He wasn't judging. He was witnessing. I crossed my arms. "I didn't want blood on the floor." "There's already blood on the snow," he replied. That night, he laid his bedroll closer to the hearth, close enough that I could hear him breathe, not close enough to touch. And for once, I didn't want to be anywhere else, because we hadn't just defended a cabin. We had drawn a line in the wilderness, and this time was standing on the side I chose. Chapter 5, How Do You Begin Again? When everything in you was built to endure, not to bloom. He didn't say goodbye. No note, no footsteps in the snow, no shift in the air to warn me. Just an absence so sharp it took the sound out of the cabin. The hearth was cold when I woke, though someone had fed it just before dawn. The bundle of kindling was stacked neatly by the door. His bedroll gone, and the hawk carving that had guarded the doorstep like a quiet sentinel vanished. I told myself at first that he'd gone to check traps or speak with the others who had stayed behind the ridge. But on the second morning, when the light came pale and unsure and there were no prints in the snow, I stopped pretending. He had left me the way wind leaves a canyon. No permission, no direction, just the echo of something that had shaped you without ever asking if it could. I spent the day cutting wood with the kind of fury that numbs. I cleaned the stovepipe even though it didn't need cleaning. I stitched a tear in a dress I hadn't worn in over a year. But grief has a way of slipping through even the smallest seams. That night, I found something inside my left boot tucked where warmth should be. A feather, carved from dark pine, small and precise. Not a hawk this time. A raven, wings folded, eyes low, as if mourning. I stared at it for a long time. He hadn't left without saying something. He'd just chosen a language I hadn't yet learned how to speak. The next morning, I walked the perimeter. No fresh snow had fallen, but even the silence was different now. The kind that settles after something has already left. By midday, I returned to the porch and sat my breath clouding around me. The hawk carving was gone, but the groove where it had stood remained, weather-worn and raw. The outline looked like a scar. I didn't cry. Not then. I just whispered his name once into the pine wind. Not to call him back, just to hear how it felt in my mouth. Like holding breath I didn't know I'd been saving. The next morning, I found a letter beneath a stone near the steps. Waxed cloth, leather twine. The handwriting was sharp and simple. I unfolded it with hands that didn't feel like mine. Clara. They will come again, not with questions, with certainty. Stay who you are. Don't turn to ash to keep others warm. I will be near. Not for you, for what you're building. Don't wait for me, but don't forget either. You still belong to the fire. T. The paper trembled, though my hands did not. The fire, I thought, not the kind that burns down homes. The kind that burns steady, that welcomes, that reminds people they are not alone. I placed the letter in the seam of Isaac's Bible, not to bury it, to honor it. That afternoon, I took down the rifle and wrapped it in oilcloth. Not because I was done fighting, because I wasn't afraid anymore. Spring was still weeks off, but something in me had thawed. On the fourth morning after his leaving, a girl appeared, no older than 12, rail-thin and sharp-eyed. She stood on the edge of my porch with a look that didn't beg and didn't ask. It simply waited. I opened the door. She said, "Are you the woman who helps?" I hesitated, then nodded. I might be. She stayed 3 nights, ate like someone used to being watched while chewing, slept near the hearth, not saying much. But she left a carved bead beside my chair before she went, unfinished, rough, and still warm from her hand. I didn't ask where she was going next. I just packed her food and stitched a button on her coat. That night I sat in silence the same way I used to when waiting for Isaac to come home, only this time it didn't ache. Because now I understood something. To had known all along. We don't survive for the sake of surviving. We endure so we have something to offer the next soul that stumbles into the cold. A week passed. I tended the garden's frozen bones, started plans for the new coop, laid new logs for the stove. Then late one dusk, just as the last of the light bled over the ridge, I heard it. Not a knock, not a voice. The crack of an axe splitting wood behind the barn. Measured, deliberate. I didn't rush. I wrapped the shawl tighter across my shoulders, stepped onto the porch. And there, right where it used to be, stood a new carving. A hawk, wings open, perched with its head turned west. But this time, it wasn't a warning. It was a welcome. In the hush of frontier wind and the slow burn of cabin fire, Clara's story reminds us of something quietly powerful, that survival is not enough. We endure not simply to get by, but so that we can choose again. Love again, build again. Many of us carry the ache of losses we never voiced. Whether it's the silence left by someone who once warmed a room just by being in it, or the longing for a purpose that's bigger than the next task on the list. This story speaks to that ache. It's about those moments when the world expects you to keep going even when your hands are still trembling. When you rebuild a life not because everything's fixed, but because you finally believe it's worth living differently this time. Clara's journey is not just hers, it mirrors the quiet strength so many live out daily without applause, like holding space for a loved one who's lost taking in someone who needs warmth, or choosing to stay open even when it would be easier to shut the door. For anyone who has ever sat in the dark and still lit a fire anyway, who's known the pain of letting go, and the courage to welcome someone new, that's the fire to spoke of. A life lived not for perfection, but for presence. Not for comfort, but for connection. You've just heard one powerful story, but many more remain untold. Click to discover more raw, gripping, deeply human tales from the Wild West.